I've been lurking here for a while, but I finally worked up the courage to post. I guess I'm just looking for perspective because, lately, my life feels like it's spiraling, and I keep circling back to my childhood as the root of all my issues. I grew up in this small town where everyone knew each other. You know, the type where you can't sneeze without half the neighborhood talking about it. On the surface, it seemed like an idyllic place to grow up, but for me it was suffocating. I was the odd one out, the white crow as my mom used to say. While the other kids were playing sports, riding bikes, or generally just being normal, I was holed up in my room with a book or fiddling with some science experiment I'd cobbled together from scraps. I loved learning. Knowledge was this safe, reliable thing in a world that felt anything but. But loving books and science in a town like mine? It didn't win you any popularity contests. My parents, George and Linda, didn't help. They were cold and distant in a way that felt personal. My dad was this towering, gruff guy who seemed to care about two things: his job and my older brother Jacob's football career. My mom? She was obsessed with appearances. She'd light up for my sister Jessica, the local beauty, like the sun came out just for her. But for me, nothing. It was like I wasn't even there half the time. Jacob and Jessica were the golden kids. Jacob was the star quarterback, beloved by the whole town. Coaches raved about him, and people would literally stop my parents in the grocery store to gush about his latest game. Jessica, on the other hand, was the quintessential small-town sweetheart, blonde, bubbly, and the kind of pretty that made everyone stare. She won every pageant she entered and dated the kind of guys who starred in those cheesy Hallmark movies my mom was obsessed with. Then there was me, the quiet, lanky kid who was always hunched over a book or muttering about some scientific discovery no one cared about. I remember this one time at dinner, I was excitedly explaining something I'd read about black holes, and my dad cut me off mid-sentence to ask Jacob about football practice. It was like that all the time. Jacob and Jessica were the sun, and I was just this annoying shadow they had to deal with. But the contempt wasn't just passive. My parents were demanding in the worst way. It was like they didn't know how to show affection, only criticism. If Jacob got a B, it was the end of the world. If I got an A, silence. When I struggled with something, it was my fault for not trying harder. If Jacob won a game, we'd have a celebratory dinner. If I came home with an award for a science competition, my mom would sigh and say something like, "That's nice, Adam, but maybe you should try joining a team sport. People like team players." Jessica wasn't much better. She had this way of looking at me like I was a stray dog that had wandered in from the rain. And Jacob? He barely acknowledged me unless it was to laugh at something I said. I know this sounds dramatic, but I don't think I ever felt loved as a kid. Cared for, sure. They fed me, clothed me, made sure I went to school. But loved? I don't know. It felt like I was just this obligation they had to deal with. Looking back, I think I coped by retreating into my own little world. Books and science became my sanctuary. It didn't matter that no one in my family understood me because the world I was building in my head felt big enough to make up for it. But now, as an adult, I wonder if that coping mechanism just made me even more isolated. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I feel like my childhood set me up to fail. I struggle with relationships because I don't know how to trust that people actually like me. Every time I meet someone, I hear my mom's voice in the back of my head, telling me I'm not enough. Every time I try to connect with someone, I see Jacob laughing at me or Jessica rolling her eyes. It's exhausting, and I don't know how to fix it. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. I know this is a lot, but it feels good to finally get it off my chest. If anyone has advice, or even just a similar story, I'd love to hear it. Looking back, if there was one bright spot in my childhood, it was Alex. We met in 5th grade, and from the start it felt like fate. Alex wasn't like the other kids. He didn't care about sports or popularity or whatever nonsense everyone else was obsessed with. Instead, he loved comics and space just like me. I still remember the day we became friends. I was sitting by myself at lunch, flipping through a battered old issue of The Amazing Spider-Man, when Alex walked up to me. "You like Spidey?" he asked, plopping down across from me. "Yeah," I mumbled, bracing myself for some kind of insult. "Cool. He's my favorite too," he said, pulling out his own comic, X-Men. "But Wolverine's the best." You can't argue with adamantium claws. That was it. That was the start of a friendship that, for a few years, felt like my lifeline. We did everything together. When we weren't reading comics, we were geeking out over space documentaries or trying to build rockets out of soda bottles in my backyard. It was the first time I didn't feel completely alone. Alex got me in a way no one else did. He didn't think I was weird for being obsessed with science, and I didn't think he was weird for bringing his telescope to sleepovers so we could stargaze. We even had this dumb plan to become astronauts together. We joke about being the first two kids from our town to make it to Mars. For a while, things felt okay. School was still rough and my family was still my family, but having Alex around made it bearable. I wasn't the lonely, bookish outcast when I was with him. I was just me, and for once that felt like enough. But then the summer before high school happened. Alex and I had spent most of that summer like we always did. Riding bikes, reading comics, and dreaming up space missions. We'd been planning this epic sleepover at his house, complete with a marathon of Star Wars movies and a homemade rocket launch the next day. I was counting down the days. But when I showed up at his house, his mom answered the door, looking flustered. "Alex isn't here," she said, her voice tight. I must have looked confused because she added, "We're moving. His dad got a new job, and we're leaving tomorrow." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Moving? Tomorrow? Alex hadn't said a word about this. Not once. Can I talk to him?" I asked, my voice cracking. She hesitated before shaking her head. "He's busy packing."
"I'm sorry, Adam."
I stood there for a moment, stunned, before muttering something about coming back later. I don't even remember the walk home. All I know is that Alex never called, never wrote, never gave me any kind of explanation. One day he was my best friend, the only person who made life bearable, and the next he was just gone. I spent the rest of that summer in a fog. It wasn't just the loneliness that got to me. It was the betrayal. How could Alex leave without even saying goodbye? Without telling me he was going? It felt like I didn't matter to him at all, like our friendship was just this thing he could toss aside without a second thought. When high school started, I was more isolated than ever. Without Alex, I had no one. No one to sit with at lunch, no one to partner with in class, no one to talk to about the stuff I actually cared about. The other kids noticed, of course. They could smell blood in the water, and they didn't waste any time reminding me just how much I didn't belong. But what hurt the most wasn't the bullying or the loneliness. It was the silence. I kept hoping, irrationally, that Alex would call or write or show up out of nowhere with some grand apology. He never did. Even now, all these years later, I still think about him sometimes. I wonder where he is, what he's doing, if he ever thinks about me. Part of me wants to track him down, but another part of me is too scared. What if I find out he really didn't care? What if I find out that I was just some phase he outgrew? I don't know. I guess I've learned to live with the disappointment, but it still lingers in the background. This nagging reminder that even the people who seem to care can leave without a second thought. And honestly, I think it's made me afraid to get close to anyone. Anyway, that's another piece of my story. Thanks for reading. 8 years. That's how long it had been since Alex disappeared from my life without so much as a goodbye. 8 years since I'd last heard from the only real friend I'd ever had. By then, I was in college, trying to find my footing in a world that still felt too big and too cold for someone like me. College was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to reinvent myself. But, surprise, I was still the same awkward, bookish kid I'd always been. I spent most of my time studying or alone in my dorm. I had acquaintances, sure, but no one I'd really call a friend. So you can imagine my shock when, out of nowhere, I got a message from Alex. It was late, and I was cramming for an organic chemistry exam when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a spam text, but when I opened it, my breath caught.
"Hey Adam."
"It's been a while. Let's catch up." "Alex." I stared at the screen, half convinced I was hallucinating. Why was he reaching out now after all this time? I wanted to be angry, to ignore him, but the truth is, a part of me had been waiting for this. I texted back something neutral. "Hey, yeah, it has. How've you been?" And within minutes, We were talking like no time had passed. He told me he'd been through a lot since we last saw each other. His parents' move hadn't been smooth, and he'd bounced between a few schools before eventually dropping out of college. Now, he was working odd jobs and trying to figure things out. It felt surreal hearing his voice again when we finally talked over the phone. The Alex I remembered had always been confident and full of ideas, but this version of him sounded restless, like he was chasing something he couldn't quite catch. We started talking more regularly, and before long, he came up with a business idea. It started small. He'd found out that some students on my campus were willing to pay good money for help with their homework. Alex figured we could make a decent side hustle out of it, and honestly, I didn't see the harm. I'd always been good at school, and the idea of making money off something that came naturally to me was tempting. First, it was simple. A few math assignments here, a term paper there. We charged $200 per assignment, split the money, and moved on. But word spread fast. It turned out there were a lot of lazy rich kids on campus willing to pay for someone else to do their work. Alex, of course, saw the potential for more. "What if we upped the stakes?" he said one night over the phone. "Homework's one thing, but exams? That's where the real money is." I was hesitant. Selling exam answers felt riskier, like we were crossing a line we couldn't come back from. But Alex had a way of making everything sound like a harmless adventure. "Come on, Adam," he said. "It's not like we're hurting anyone. They're just paying for a head start. Besides, we'll be smart about it. No one's gonna catch us." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Alex handled the logistics. He had a guy, don't ask me how he knew him, who could get us access to test keys and answer sheets. My job was to find the clients and handle the transactions. We started charging $2,500 per exam, and to my shock, people were willing to pay without batting an eye. For a while, it felt like we'd struck gold. The money rolled in faster than I'd ever imagined. I was finally able to pay off some of my student loans and even treat myself to things I'd never had growing up. Alex, meanwhile, used his cut to buy a new car and rent a nicer apartment. But as much as I tried to convince myself we weren't doing anything wrong, the guilt started to creep in. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to call me out. And Alex, he was thriving. It was like he'd found his purpose in life, scheming and hustling. We kept the operation going for almost a year, but deep down, I knew we were playing with fire. Alex always talked about expanding, about taking things to the next level, but I wasn't so sure. Part of me wanted to pull out before things got out of hand, but another part of me was addicted to the thrill and the money. Looking back, I think I knew it couldn't last. But at the time, it felt like we were untouchable, like we'd finally found a way to beat the system. It's funny, isn't it? The same person who'd abandoned me all those years ago had come back into my life, and together we were walking a razor's edge. Maybe I should have seen the warning signs. Maybe I should have said no. But Alex had always had this way of pulling me in, of making me feel like I wasn't just some awkward outcast. And for that, I was willing to risk everything. After graduating college, Alex and I knew we couldn't stick around. We'd made over $75,000 from our little business. And while that kind of money felt life-changing at first, it came with a price: paranoia. Every time I heard a knock at my door or saw a campus official walking toward me, I assumed it was the end. Alex brushed it off. But even he couldn't deny the tension when a professor mentioned rumors of cheating circulating around campus. We agreed it was time to bail, and of course Alex had a plan. "Hong Kong," he said, grinning like it was the most obvious answer in the world. "It's perfect. Big city, tons of opportunities, and no one's gonna ask too many questions about where we came from." I wasn't convinced at first. Moving halfway across the world wasn't exactly something I'd ever considered. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I didn't have anything tying me down. No family I was close to, no relationships, no real reason to stay. And if I was being honest, the idea of disappearing into a city as massive and chaotic as Hong Kong was appealing. So, a week after graduation, we packed our bags and left. Hong Kong was everything Alex promised and more. The city felt alive in a way I'd never experienced before. Bright lights, packed streets, and a buzz of energy that made it impossible to feel invisible. We found a cheap apartment in Kowloon, crammed into a tiny space with barely enough room to breathe. But for the first time in a long time, I felt free. With our remaining money, we decided to start a business. Alex's idea, of course. He'd been reading up on digital marketing and convinced me it was the future. We registered a small startup, threw together a website, and started taking on freelance clients. To my surprise, we actually did pretty well. Alex handled the networking and sales while I focused on the technical side, building websites, managing campaigns, and running analytics. It wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was honest work, and for a few months, things were good. We even started to believe we'd left our past behind. But then the emails started. The first one came late at night. I was working on a client's SEO report when a notification popped up on my laptop. The subject line was blank, but the message was impossible to ignore. I know what you did. $50,000 by the end of the week, or everyone else will know too. My stomach dropped. I called Alex immediately, and after a long silence, he finally muttered, "It's probably just a bluff." But it wasn't. The next day, we got another email. This time, it included details, dates, names, even screenshots of transactions from our old business. Whoever this person was, they had access to everything. "We have to pay," I said, pacing our tiny apartment. "No, we don't," Alex snapped. "If we give them money now, they'll just keep coming back for more." We argued about it for hours, but in the end, Alex convinced me to wait. "Let's see if they're serious," he said. "They'll back off when they realize we're not scared." But they didn't back off. The emails kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. The amount jumped from $50,000 to $200,000, and the person started dropping hints about our whereabouts, mentioning the street we lived on, the coffee shop we frequented. By then, I was a wreck. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like someone was watching me. Alex, as usual, kept his cool. He acted like the whole thing was a game, another challenge to outsmart. "We just have to figure out who's behind this," he said one night, sprawled on the couch with his laptop. "Once we know, we can make them back off." But I wasn't so sure. Whoever this was, they had us cornered, and they knew it. As much as I hated to admit it, Alex was right about one thing: if we paid, it might never stop. But the longer we waited, the worse the threats became. For the first time, I started to wonder if we'd made a mistake coming here. Hong Kong was supposed to be our fresh start, our escape. But now it felt like we'd brought the past with us, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. I didn't know what to do. Alex was my only ally, the only person I could trust, and even he seemed more focused on winning this game than on keeping us safe. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in years, I felt truly powerless. The walls finally caved in, just like I knew they would. The emails had escalated to the point where I could barely sleep. The blackmailer wasn't bluffing. They had too much information, too many details about what Alex and I had done back in college. I kept telling Alex we were in over our heads, but he refused to see it that way. "Trust me, Adam," he said, pacing our cramped apartment one night. "Whoever this is, they're just trying to scare us. They don't have the guts to follow through." But they did. One morning, we woke up to find printed copies of some of the incriminating emails stuffed under our apartment door. That was the moment I knew it was over. Whoever this person was, they weren't just playing a game, they were dead serious, and they were close. Alex finally caved and agreed we needed to figure out who was behind it. He spent hours combing through our old client records, looking for anyone who might have had a grudge or reason to turn on us. I wasn't much help. My mind was too clouded with panic. Then, one night, Alex burst into the living room with a look that was equal parts triumph and dread. "I found him," he said, slamming his laptop shut. It turned out the blackmailer was a former client, a guy we'd worked with toward the end of our operation in college. He'd paid us for help on a term paper, and we'd delivered, no questions asked. But what we didn't know was that he'd been quietly collecting evidence on us the entire time. Emails, transaction records, even screenshots of conversations. "He's a nobody," Alex said, trying to downplay the situation. "We'll scare him off." But I wasn't convinced. "How?" I asked, my voice shaking. "He's already got everything. If we go after him, he'll just hand it all over to the cops." Alex didn't have an answer for that. A few days later, the hammer finally dropped. I was at a coffee shop, trying to distract myself with work, when two plainclothes officers walked up to me. They didn't even have to say anything. I knew what was happening the moment I saw them. Adam, last name, one of them said, flashing a badge. We need you to come with us. The ride to the station felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Alex, wondering if he'd been caught too. As soon as I arrived, I got my answer. He was already there, sitting in a cold, gray interrogation room with his head in his hands. The blackmailer had gone to the authorities with everything. Not just our illegal operation in college, but our activities in Hong Kong too. It was all laid out in meticulous detail. There was no way out. The trial was quick. The evidence was overwhelming, and neither of us had the resources to fight it. We both pleaded guilty, hoping for leniency, but the judge wasn't in a forgiving mood. 8 years in a Hong Kong prison, followed by deportation to the U.S. Prison was brutal. The isolation, the constant feeling of vulnerability, the gnawing guilt. It was all-consuming. Alex and I were housed in the same facility, but it was clear our partnership was over. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own misery. I spent a lot of time thinking about how we got here, how I let Alex pull me into his schemes, how I let my desperation for connection and acceptance blind me to the risks. I blamed him, sure, but I blamed myself even more. When the 8 years finally ended, I didn't feel relief, just emptiness. We were shipped back to the U.S., where we were greeted with more questions, more paperwork, and the weight of starting over with nothing. I haven't spoken to Alex since. I heard he moved to another state, but I didn't ask for details. As for me, I'm trying to rebuild, but it's hard. My past feels like a shadow that's always there, no matter how far I run. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that shortcuts come with a cost. And sometimes that cost is everything. When I finally got back to the States after 8 brutal years in a Hong Kong prison, I thought the worst was behind me. I was wrong. Stepping off the plane felt surreal. I didn't expect a hero's welcome, but part of me hoped for something, a familiar face, maybe even some kind of support. Instead, I was met with silence. My family didn't even bother to show up. It stung, but I told myself it was for the best. We'd never been close, and I didn't want to explain where I'd been or why I had nothing to my name. Still, a part of me wanted closure. I hadn't seen my parents, George and Linda, since before everything fell apart. Against my better judgment, I decided to visit. Their reaction was cold, to say the least. My mom barely looked up from her crossword puzzle when I walked through the door, and my dad grunted something that might have been hello. It was clear they weren't thrilled to see me, but I wasn't there for a warm reunion. After some awkward small talk, I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at me. Did you know anything about what happened to me? My dad's jaw tightened, and my mom froze mid-sip of her coffee. For a moment, I thought they were going to deny everything, but then my mom sighed. Adam, there's something you should know, she said, setting her mug down. It's about Liam. Liam. I hadn't thought about my adoptive brother in years. He wasn't a part of my life growing up, but my parents had taken him in as a teenager after his own family passed away. I barely knew him, and by the time I went to college, he'd drifted out of the picture. What about him? I asked, my stomach tightening. He was the one, my dad said bluntly. He was the one who blackmailed you and Alex. For a second, I couldn't breathe. What? I managed to choke out. It wasn't personal, my mom said quickly, as if that made it better. Liam overheard something about what you were doing back in college. He saw an opportunity and took it. And, well, we might have helped him. Helped him? My own parents had helped blackmail me and ruin my life? You've got to be kidding me, I said, my voice shaking with anger. My dad shrugged. You were committing crimes, Adam. You and Alex. If Liam hadn't turned you in, someone else would have. At least this way, the money stayed in the family. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Not only had my adoptive brother betrayed me, but my parents, my own parents, had stood by and let it happen. Worse, they'd encouraged it. The conversation devolved into shouting. I demanded answers, but all I got were excuses. My mom kept saying they did what they thought was best, while my dad made snide comments about how I'd always been trouble. I stormed out, vowing never to speak to them again. But it didn't end there. A few weeks later, I got served with legal papers. My parents were suing me. They'd somehow learned that I was trying to start a new business. Something small, a freelance web design gig to help me get back on my feet. They wanted a cut, claiming that they were entitled to it because family supports family. The irony was staggering. I tried to fight it, but they had money and resources I didn't. The whole ordeal dragged on for months, draining what little energy and hope I had left. I eventually settled just to get them out of my life. Now I'm back to square one. I don't know what hurts more, the betrayal or the fact that, deep down, I should have seen it coming. My parents had always favored Jacob and Jessica. I was never really part of their ideal family, and Liam fit that mold better than I ever did. As for Liam, I haven't heard from him. I don't want to. This whole mess has left me questioning everything. Who I am, who I can trust, and whether I'll ever really escape my past. I don't know if I'll ever forgive them. Honestly, I'm not even sure if I want to. Thanks for letting me vent. Reddit. It feels good to get this off my chest, even if it doesn't change anything. Just when I thought my life couldn't get any more surreal, things took a sharp turn. After months of struggling with my parents' lawsuit and the emotional fallout from their betrayal, I finally caught a break. Or rather, Alex reached out. Yeah, that Alex. The same guy I hadn't spoken to since we got out of prison. I heard what's going on, he said over the phone, his voice surprisingly calm. Your parents, Liam? They're screwing you over, aren't they? I didn't know how he'd found out, but it didn't matter. I admitted everything. The lawsuit, the betrayal, the way Liam and my parents had ruined my life. Let me help, he said. I was hesitant at first. Alex and I had been through hell together, and while I didn't hate him, I wasn't sure I trusted him either. But he was relentless, insisting that we had to fight back. We've got nothing to lose, he said. And if there's one thing I'm good at, it's digging up dirt. Reluctantly, I agreed. Together, we hired a pair of private detectives to start investigating my parents and Liam. First, it felt like a long shot. What could we possibly find that would make any difference? But then, the detectives uncovered something huge. It turned out that my parents hadn't just stood by while Liam blackmailed me and Alex. They'd actively participated. The detectives found bank records showing that Liam had funneled a portion of the blackmail money directly to my parents' accounts. They weren't just complicit. They were co-conspirators. When the evidence came in, I felt a mix of rage and vindication. All those years of being treated like an outsider, like I was the family's screw-up, and this was what they were hiding? They'd been lining their pockets while I was rotting in a Hong Kong prison. Alex and I didn't waste any time. We turned over everything to the authorities, and within weeks, my parents and Liam were arrested. The trial was fast, given the mountain of evidence against them. Between the bank records, emails, and testimony from our private detectives, they didn't stand a chance. The judge sentenced all three of them, my parents and Liam, to 10 years in prison. Sitting in that courtroom, hearing the verdict, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Closure. It wasn't about revenge. It was about finally seeing the truth come to light. For the first time, I didn't feel like the victim. I'd stood up for myself and I'd won. Alex and I parted ways again after the trial. He said he was heading to South America to start fresh. And honestly, I wished him the best. Whatever mistakes we'd made in the past, he'd come through when it mattered most. As for me, I'm still trying to rebuild. My life is far from perfect, but I feel lighter now, like I'm no longer carrying the weight of everything that's happened. I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm hopeful. Thanks for sticking with me through this. Reddit. It's been a long, crazy ride, but I'm finally starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, I can move on. After everything Alex and I had been through, blackmail, betrayal, prison, we found ourselves back at square one. The victory in court felt good, but it didn't erase the years of damage. Still, there was a strange sense of opportunity in starting over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Alex and I were on the same page. We decided to do things right this time. No shortcuts, no shady deals, no cutting corners. The idea for our new business came almost accidentally. While preparing for the case against my parents and Liam, Alex and I had worked with private detectives, PR consultants, and legal experts to manage the fallout and protect ourselves. It wasn't easy, but it taught us something valuable. There was a market for people who needed help digging out of their own messes. Reputation restoration, crisis management. It was a high-risk, high-reward field, and given our experience with navigating disasters, most of them self-inflicted, it seemed like the perfect fit. We pooled what little money we had left and started small. Our first few clients were individuals and small businesses caught up in local controversies. Stuff like bad press, disgruntled employees, or social media backlashes. At first, it was just the two of us working out of a dingy office we could barely afford. Alex handled the networking, pulling in clients with his smooth-talking charm, while I focused on the strategy and technical side of things. Our big break came when a mid-sized tech company hired us to clean up after a major data breach. It was a mess. Lawsuits, public outrage, media scrutiny, but we pulled them through it. Word got out and suddenly bigger clients started calling. Within 2 years, we'd expanded to 5 cities. New York, Los Angeles, Hong Kong, ironic, I know, London, and Singapore. We had a full team of employees, PR specialists, data analysts, legal consultants, all working under the umbrella of our new company. We were earning millions, and for the first time it didn't feel like the rug could be pulled out from under us at any moment. But success came with its own risks. The work was intense and often dangerous. We weren't just dealing with bad Yelp reviews or angry tweets. We were managing billion-dollar corporations in the middle of scandals, political figures accused of corruption, and high-profile individuals trying to salvage their reputations. The pressure was relentless, and there were times when Alex and I both wondered if we'd bitten off more than we could chew. But we learned to be cautious, to think 2 steps ahead, to protect ourselves in ways we hadn't before. There were moments of tension between us, remnants of the old wounds we'd both carried, but we made it work. At the end of the day, Alex was still the same person who'd pulled me out of my shell all those years ago, and I was still the guy who believed in his crazy ideas. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far we've come. From 2 kids dreaming about space to college criminals to business partners running a global company. It's been a long, twisted road, and while I wouldn't wish parts of it on anyone, I don't regret where we ended up. We're careful now. We know how quickly things can fall apart, how easy it is to make a mistake that can cost you everything. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're building something that matters, something we can be proud of. So that's where things stand. Reddit. It's not the fairy tale ending I once imagined, but it's real, and it's ours. Thanks for listening to my story. Here's to new beginnings, no matter how messy the path to get there.